In their first call since 7 aid workers were killed in Gaza, President Biden telling Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu that he must reduce civilian harm or else the United States will change its policy on the war. But the White House insisting this doesn't mean U.S. support for Israel is wavering. NTD's Iris Tao has more from the White House.
The 30-minute call was the two leaders' first conversation after what Israel called an unintentional airstrike killed 7 aid workers from the World Central Kitchen in Gaza. The White House says President Biden told Netanyahu that the strike was unacceptable, adding that if Israel does not make more changes to reduce civilian casualties, U.S. policy on the war in Gaza will change. Watch.
The president made clear that that absent changes in the protection of civilians on the ground, and absent, a calming down, that he will have to reconsider his own policy choices with respect to Gaza.
The White House says it's expecting announcements from Israel on these actions in the coming hours or days. And President Biden is also calling for an immediate temporary ceasefire in Gaza. The strong language, meanwhile, comes as President Biden is increasingly facing pressure from some voters who say they don't want to see Biden further support Israel. But the White House insists that today's message about a potential shift in policy does not mean that the U.S. is wavering in its support for Israel. Watch.
Both things are true. Our support is ironclad and consistent. It's not going to stop. It's not going to waver. But will there perhaps be some policy changes we might have to make if we don't see policy changes out of Israel? Yes.
Still, today's readout of the call marks a significant shift in the Biden administration's at least public message. Before the call, the White House said on Wednesday that the U.S. would not consider changes on its policy on Israel. But now it's hinging on what Israel would do next. Reporting from the White House, Iris Tao, NTD News.
And Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is in China today. She'll be asking Chinese manufacturers to change their trade model, which threatens economies around the world, including the United States. NTD's Jack Bradley joins us from the State Department. Jack, what's the latest on this?
Hey, good evening, Steve. Yeah, well, Janet Yellen just arrived in Guangzhou, China. That's China's largest industry hub in the south. Now, China has been overproducing products related to energy goods, and this Yellen is going to be discussing with Chinese officials there about this. Energy goods like electric vehicles, batteries, solar panels, they're able to overproduce excessively these products because for years the Chinese regime has been subsidizing these products and combine that with a low demand at home. The Chinese regime is able to produce these products and sell them overseas in the global market at very low prices. This puts it at a huge advantage. So Yellen hasn't ruled out the fact that she'll increase tariffs on China. Here she is yesterday in Alaska on a stop on a refueling trip on her way to China.
We want to continue, and we think we both benefit from trade and investment, but that it needs to be in a level playing field.
Now, over the last few years, the Biden administration has been able to rake in tens of billions of dollars in tariff money on Chinese exports, and those were tariffs that were implemented under the Trump administration in 2018 and left untouched. Now, earlier I spoke with Stephen Mosher, the president of the Population Research Institute and author of The Devil and Communist China. Now, he told me that Yellen on this trip should implement stronger trade negotiating tactics like increasing tariffs to pressure China to change its business practices. Take a look.
I think the tariffs should actually be increased to match the level of the subsidies that the Chinese Communist Party is providing industry. They are very dependent on their export base now because the domestic sector of the economy is quite frankly floundering. They need the export sector. Now is the time to put pressure on them.
Now, Yellen will hold a series of talks with these Chinese economic officials over the weekend, and there are signs that China will not respond to these concerns. In the Chinese state-run media outlet Global Times, they called these overcapacity statements a smear campaign. We'll keep you updated as these talks unfold. Steve.
NTD's Jack Bradley with that live report from the State Department. Thank you, Jack. And while Secretary Yellen talks with Chinese officials about the effects China's dumping has on the United States economy, the $34 trillion national debt is having a devastating impact on interest rates and the cost of living for Americans. Our next guest, Steve Hayes, is of Americans for Fair Taxation. We're happy to have him on to discuss. Steve Hayes, thank you so much for joining.
I'm delighted to be with you, Steve. I'm looking forward to this.
Same here. Great to have you, Steve. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen in China meeting with top officials, including Xi Jinping. She discussed with reporters yesterday the administration's concerns about China's overcapacity and the spillovers that Chinese subsidies are having on the United States. She didn't offer any specific plans to discuss tariffs or trade restrictions. Didn't rule that out, however. What message do you hope she'll bring to China that will protect the United States and the American people?
Well, I'm hoping that what she'll bring is that if they don't clean up what they're doing in terms of, literally trying to destroy business over here by subsidies and by the way they import things, because they know if they bring product over at a low enough price, that U.S. businesses will not be able to stay in business long enough to compete because they're not getting the same subsidies. So they're trying to drive these people out of business, and then they can raise the prices from China and have free reign. So what I believe she needs to do is what President Trump did, is let them know that there are going to be consequences to that type of action, and that retaliation is actually something that we are quite capable of doing, not only by restricting their imports, but by relocating and giving incentives to do things which are happening now in countries outside of China. And that's really a huge problem for them.
Steve, talk to us about our debt. And, there's a lot of foreign buyers, but those are starting to dry up. How concerned are you with our national debt?
I think it's a very great concern. Unfortunately, it doesn't stop the present administration from having a $2 trillion deficit. They've added $6 trillion to the deficit, or the national debt rather, since they came in office. But it's today's problem. The average home price or home mortgage payments over the last 4 years have gone up to $12,000 more a year. And the reason is that the foreign purchases of our debt, which has been the bedrock for a long time, is decreasing because they're becoming more and more concerned about the stability of our ability to pay it back. And so you're seeing the Fed, or the Treasury rather, go out and have to put it on the market and count on individuals, and Americans primarily, to purchase the debt. And so you get this competition because there's only a certain amount of money that can be used. And as demand for that amount of money goes up, then you have higher rates. And it's only going to become worse because, again, the foreign portion of the debt is reducing, and the U.S. portion is having to increase.
The national debt is now more than $34 trillion. Social Security and Medicare reportedly expected to run out in about 10 years. The latest polls show American voters are most concerned about inflation in the economy. How will the debt play into the general election in November? And, talk to us about what people are actually feeling.
Well, I think it's going to play very little, unfortunately, into the election, because President Trump, even though he went in office saying, I'm going to balance the budget and start reducing the debt within 8 years. And of course, he was a big spender as well. He borrowed a lot of money. Now, you can blame COVID for some of that and maybe a lot of that. I think both parties in D.C. really want people to stay asleep because they see the debt as a way of continuing to keep the masses quiet and to buy votes. I don't believe they see the Social Security problem as the problem that we see it, or they would have done something already. They, I think, believe they'll just borrow the money for this. And frankly, as we saw with inflation before, you're going to have consequences when you start doing that. Not only are you going to drive interest rates up for everybody else, buying a home, buying a car, paying credit card debt, but you're also going to see a real increase in the cost of living and the lowering of money that families have in their bank accounts to live. And that's going to become more and more devastating.
Steve Hayes, fascinating perspective. Really appreciate you joining us. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
The Biden administration today announcing a new rule that will make it harder to reshape the federal workforce. More specifically, it will prevent the government from reclassifying civil servants as political appointees. The Office of Personnel Management issuing the rule just before the 2020 election, President Trump issued an executive order that sought to reclassify thousands of federal workers, which would make them easier to fire. The rule also offers an appeals process for those who had their job categories moved to a more vulnerable position. Worth noting, civil servants are permanent employees of the government, while political appointees have to be picked by the president, vice president, or agency head. They often serve for a short term and are more liable to termination. The new rule is expected to take effect this May. Thank you for watching the Capitol Report. If you want to see our full broadcast, check us out at epochtv.com.